In the twilight years of the 18th century, New York City was a patchwork quilt of ambition, legacy, and confusion. It was a city on the rise but burdened by its past, an old-world web of crooked lanes and colonial whims trying to support the weight of a new nation's most bustling port. This was not the New York of gleaming towers and snaking subways. This was a frontier city in flux, where pigs roamed muddy streets and neighborhoods sprawled without logic. Back then, no central plan governed the streets of Manhattan. Instead, growth was organic, uncoordinated, and often chaotic. A curve here, a lane there, a square that served a rich family's estate and ignored the needs of the public. By the mid-1700s, this had become not just inconvenient, but dangerous. Fires swept through tightly packed wooden buildings, disease festered in poorly drained streets, and the haphazard sprawl made even small-scale commerce a nightmare. Maps from the era tell the story vividly. The 1767 Ratzer map shows a tangle of streets in lower Manhattan, winding and inconsistent. Some neighborhoods tried to impose order with private plans, but these were the exception, not the rule. The Delancey family, for example, envisioned a grid around their estate, even including a large square. But after the Revolutionary War, when their British sympathies cost them their land, the city quietly erased those plans. Meanwhile, the population ballooned. From 1770 to 1790, it more than doubled. The pressure was mounting, and with repeated outbreaks of yellow fever and other illnesses, the demand for open space and efficient circulation became not just a matter of convenience, but a survival. Yet still, the city resisted centralized planning. There was hesitation. Perhaps it was pride, the belief that New York would find its own way. Or perhaps it was fear of committing to a vision that would be difficult to reverse. But history, as it often does, had other plans. At the turn of the 19th century, two names emerged from the city rolls: Joseph Mangin, an architect, and Casimir Goek, a city surveyor. In 1797, the city commissioned them to design a new map, a vision for New York not as it was, but as it could be. Mangin and Goek's plan was daring. They proposed not only a rationalized street system but an expanded waterfront. They widened the city's crooked alleys, imposed clean lines, and even added land where none existed. Their goal wasn't to reflect the present but to anticipate the future. But New York was not yet ready for such foresight. Though submitted with care and detail, their plan was quietly shelved. Critics called it presumptuous. Some accused them of attempting to beautify a city that needed basic infrastructure, not grand design. Most damning, perhaps, was its idealism. In an era of rising commercial ambition, the Mangin-Goek plan was too graceful, too slow, too speculative. Instead, the city drifted again. But their work wasn't in vain. Though rejected, the plan left an impression. It planted the seed that perhaps New York could be something more than chaos. And it came at just the right time. Because in 1807, facing explosive population growth and mounting health crises, the state of New York decided to act. They formed a new commission. And this time, the future would not be imagined by architects or surveyors. It would be shaped by power. The new commissioners appointed in 1807 were not city planners in the modern sense. Gouverneur Morris, John Rutherford, and Simeon DeWitt were men of influence, land, and pragmatism. Their task was not to beautify but to organize, not to imagine a utopia, but to prepare for an inevitable wave of growth. This was a different time and a different mindset. By 1811, the trio released their plan. It was bold in its simplicity, a straight grid of streets and avenues running from Houston Street to 155th, blanketing the island in order. Gone were the flourishes of Washington, D.C. circles and diagonal avenues. This was no Pierre L'Enfant fantasy. It was pure function. They explained their choice clearly. Right-angled houses are the most cheap to build and the most convenient to live in. Their goal was efficiency. The grid did not honor the island's hills, nor its rivers. It cut through topography and tradition alike. It ignored estates, slope roads, and even wetlands. What mattered was regularity, predictability, simplicity, and developers loved it. A uniform grid meant easier lot sales, easier infrastructure, easier everything. For a growing city that saw land not as heritage but as opportunity, this was gold. Opponents, like Frederick Law Olmsted decades later, would lament the lost chance for a more harmonious cityscape. They would point to Central Park as a counterexample of natural integration. But by then, the grid had won. The 1811 Commissioner's Plan mapped over 2,000 blocks. It standardized the distance between streets, 200 feet, and avenues, about 800 feet. It named only a few of them, leaving the rest as numbered placeholders, a system that seemed cold at the time, but would become iconic. Importantly, the plan anticipated a city far larger than its current boundaries. At the time, much of the island north of 23rd Street was farmland or wilderness. But the commissioners saw the writing on the wall. They wrote that their grid prepared for a greater population than is collected at any spot on this side of China. They were right. Within decades, the grid had become a framework not just for streets, but for society. It guided water pipes, gas lines, transit systems. It enabled speculation, subdivision, and construction at a pace few cities could match. It also shaped the psychology of the city. The predictability of the grid gave newcomers a sense of orientation. Numbered streets were democratic. They didn't honor kings or patrons, but order and progress. The northward push of the grid became a metaphor for ambition. Immigrants, merchants, and workers could map their futures block by block. Yet not all was gained. The flattening of the island's natural features meant more flooding. The rigid system limited creativity in public space. And over time, uniformity became monotony. Still, the grid endured. And with every new building that rose, it seemed less like a plan and more like destiny. Today, the Manhattan grid is both a marvel and a mystery. To visitors, it feels intuitive. To locals, it is muscle memory. You don't just walk the grid. You inhabit it. But it is also a monument to compromise. The city we see is not the best of all possible plans. It is the plan that worked. Other cities, Philadelphia, Savannah, Washington, tried to balance order with beauty, morality with geometry. Their planners dreamed of enlightenment and equity. But Manhattan's grid, with its relentless regularity, was unapologetically practical. And yet, from that practicality sprang greatness. Broadway, the lone rebel street, cuts through the grid like a story untold. Central Park, carved out in the 1850s, offers a natural sanctuary in defiance of the rectangles that surround it. And the skyline, that glorious forest of glass and steel, owes its roots to a decision made not with artistry, but arithmetic. City plans reflect values. And in 1811, New York's value was growth. The commissioner's plan was not perfect, but it made the city possible. Without it, there would be no rush hour, no Empire State Building, no neighborhoods with names like Soho or Hell's Kitchen, each defined as much by their coordinates as their culture. In the end, the grid did more than shape streets. It shaped lives. It made movement easier, dreams closer, and direction clearer. And perhaps that's why, even today, when the sunset lines up just right and the light floods the avenues from river to river, we pause. Because for a moment, in the heart of the city that never sleeps, the grid reminds us, someone once dared to draw lines across chaos. And in doing so, they built New York.